One of the easiest ways to diminish the Bible has always been remarkably simple. Declare its central figures to be legends. Not liars, not mistakes. Legends. Powerful, beautiful, culturally significant legends, but still placed on the far side of real history. And if there was one figure in the Old Testament especially easy to push into that half-mythical zone, it was King David. The figure is too large, too central to the entire biblical tradition, too deeply engraved in religious memory. For the skeptical view, he was almost a perfect target. The more significant a figure is within Scripture, the stronger the temptation to dismiss him as a later symbol, assembled from tradition, exaggeration, and national ideology. The logic sounded convincing enough. If there is no direct and unambiguous confirmation outside the Bible, then perhaps we are not dealing with a historical king at all, but with an image around which a dynastic mythology was later built. That is exactly why the discovery at Tel Dan was so inconvenient. In northern Israel, archaeologists uncovered fragments of an ancient Aramaic inscription, apparently commissioned by one of the kings who fought against neighboring states in the region. This was not a biblical text, not a religious manuscript, not a later commentary by a believing scribe. It was an external inscription, created in an entirely different political logic, as a monument to victory, power, and military strength. And it was there that researchers encountered a phrase that landed like a blow: House of David. Pause for a moment and consider why that matters so much. This does not mean archaeologists found David's biography, his throne, his palace, or a detailed chronicle of his reign. No, the point is subtler than that. In the ancient world, an expression like House of David was not poetic ornament. It meant dynastic reality. It referred to a ruling line, a house from which kings claimed descent. A political dynasty well enough known that even an external enemy could invoke its name in his own inscription. And that alone begins to dismantle the most convenient part of the old skeptical construction. Because if David had been nothing more than a late legend, if he were only a striking image invented centuries afterward, then a very simple question follows. Why does an independent source speak of his house as though it were a familiar political reality? This is where the real tension begins. Before that discovery, it was still possible to argue that David belonged only to the inner world of biblical memory. After it, that became much harder to maintain. His name stepped beyond the biblical text. It appeared not in prayer, not in a psalm, not in theological reflection, but in stone, left behind in the hard world of ancient Near Eastern politics, where no one had any habit of honoring another people's sacred figures for free. And this was only the first crack, because once a figure like David begins to return from the realm of myth, the entire old picture starts to wobble. If there was a historical core where people had spent decades seeing only legend, then how many other such legends are still waiting beneath the soil for their moment to emerge? In the name of one king, even a figure like David can still be forced into the category of a partial coincidence. One might say, fine, perhaps there really was some historical dynasty behind the figure, but does that make the Bible a reliable source? Can a single name carved in stone really confirm an entire world? Wars, neighboring kingdoms, political conflict, struggles over land, alliances, betrayals? The skeptical position has long depended on exactly this retreat. Concede one inconvenient fact in order to preserve the rest of the wall. And this is where the Mesha Stele enters the picture. At first glance, it looks like just another ancient inscription, a stone, a text, a monument to royal pride, but only until you understand what is actually speaking through it. This is not an internal biblical narrative, nor a later religious tradition. It is the voice of the other side, the voice of the Moabite king. A man from a neighboring world, from a hostile political sphere, who had no intention of confirming the Bible, and certainly no desire to assist future believers. He was speaking about himself, his victory, his God, and his war. And that is precisely why this discovery matters so much. Because all at once, it becomes clear that behind the pages of the Bible, there really does stand a recognizable map of the ancient Near East. Moab, Israel, kings, military pressure, lost and recovered territories, the humiliation of the defeated, the language of political confrontation. For too long, all of this was treated as though it belonged only to a sacred narrative, half detached from ordinary history. But the Mesha Stele pulls us back into a reality where neighboring kingdoms do not exist as symbols. They fight, they boast, they exaggerate their victories, they raise monuments, they leave behind stone shaped not by liturgy, but by the hard logic of power. That is what makes the discovery so dangerous for any oversimplified version of the past. Because all at once it becomes clear that the Bible suddenly sounds less like an isolated religious book and more like a text that emerged from within a concrete historical environment. There is not merely a people of God floating in abstract spiritual space. There are neighbors, enemies, border conflicts, regional ambitions, and a constant struggle for survival among small kingdoms trapped in the brutal politics of the ancient Near East. And the Mesha Stele shows that this world was not literary scenery. It was real. One point matters especially here. Inscriptions like this were almost never written for the sake of objectivity. Ancient kings were not historians in the modern sense. They wrote about themselves the way victors always have, loudly, confidently, sometimes mercilessly. But that is exactly where the strength of the discovery lies. Even when a ruler exaggerates his own greatness, he is still speaking from within a real conflict. He may distort the scale, but he cannot invent the entire political landscape from nothing. And so when that landscape begins to echo the biblical text, we are no longer dealing with a random resemblance. We are dealing with a convergence in the very fabric of the age. And here again, the old skeptical defense begins to crack. First, the House of David emerges from the earth. Then comes a stone on which a neighboring kingdom speaks from the same tense reality reflected in the biblical text. And quietly, the entire argument begins to shift. The issue is no longer whether one rare confirmation can be found. The real question is this: why is it that whenever archaeology truly touches ancient Israel and its surroundings, what rises before us is not a fog of myth, but a hard, recognizable world of kingdoms, war, and power? And that is far more difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Even after all the early confirmations, the skeptic could retreat once more. One might argue, yes, there were kings. Yes, there were cities. Yes, there were dynasties. But the Bible itself? Could the narratives about wars, alliances, betrayals, and the struggles over land still be more than literary invention? Could the events described truly match the scale suggested in Scripture? This is exactly where Assyria enters the picture. Not a small neighboring kingdom, but one of the most formidable empires of the ancient Near East. A conquest machine leaving behind archives, reliefs, and monumental inscriptions. When this empire intersects with the biblical text, the debate changes. Suddenly, we are not talking about isolated details. We are talking about the same events described from two independent perspectives, the Bible and the Annals of Empire. The biblical account describes Sennacherib's campaign against Judah during the reign of Hezekiah. For centuries, this could have been dismissed as a narrative device, a small kingdom facing a massive empire, portrayed to inspire awe and religious meaning. But the Assyrian annals appear, detailed records of military campaigns, city sieges, and subjugation. The convergence is striking. The geography matches, the kings match, the military events match. The narrative is no longer a poetic or symbolic construct. It is an account embedded in real political and military reality. Hezekiah's role is particularly striking. In Scripture, he is the king facing almost certain destruction. In the Assyrian account, He is the ruler of a real state under the pressure of a genuine empire. His world ceases to be a symbolic backdrop. It becomes a historical reality. And that is why the Mesha Stele and the Annals of Sennacherib are so inconvenient for the notion that the Bible is primarily literary. They show a recognizable political world, independent of religious narrative, which confirms the text's historical grounding. The convergence of these independent sources can no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The Bible appears embedded in reality, reflecting the kingdoms, conflicts, and pressures of the time. Even skeptics must confront this alignment. It is the first serious signal that the biblical text often coincides with history far more than previously assumed. Even with David and the Assyrian evidence, skeptics could still argue that the biblical world was only partially historical. Real names and cities, perhaps, but the narratives, drama, and politics could have been embellished later. This is where Hezekiah's tunnel becomes crucial. At first glance, it may appear to be a simple ancient engineering project, a narrow passage carved through stone. But the tunnel was far more than that. It was a life-saving structure designed to bring water into Jerusalem during a siege. Here, the Bible intersects with concrete engineering. Scripture's description of the city's preparations is not abstract. It corresponds to a real, functional tunnel that still exists. Inside the tunnel, the Siloam inscription provides further evidence. The text, carved during construction, documents the workers' progress and marks the completion of the tunnel. This is not literary flourish. It is a first-hand record of human labor. Stone and text together confirm that the city, the engineering, and the events described in Scripture were materially real. The significance is profound. Skeptics can no longer argue that biblical accounts are purely symbolic when the evidence underfoot aligns with the narrative. Tunnels, inscriptions, water management all demonstrate a precise knowledge of the urban environment, reflecting practical concerns that no legend or literary invention could easily reproduce. In short, the tunnel and the inscription restore both the practicality and the historical grounding of Hezekiah's Jerusalem. It is a place where faith and history intersect, revealing that biblical authors described not a conceptual city, but a living, functioning capital under real threat. After Hezekiah's tunnel, the focus shifts to Lachish, a fortified city whose fall exemplifies the realities of ancient warfare. In Scripture, Lachish is described as a key stronghold of Judah under siege by the Assyrians. Archaeological evidence confirms this. Reliefs from Sennacherib's palace depict the assault, and destruction layers at the site align with the biblical account. Here, three independent sources converge: the biblical text, Assyrian royal propaganda, and the physical archaeological record. The Bible presents the narrative, the Assyrians boast of their conquest, and the stones themselves preserve the traces of fire, collapse, and siege. Together, they form a triangulated historical reality. The impact is significant. One can no longer claim that the biblical account is purely literary, symbolic, or embellished. The city, the destruction, the military logistics, and the imperial perspective all intersect in a tangible, measurable reality. Lachish becomes a proving ground for understanding how the Bible reflects the material and political world of its time. The convergence here is not merely coincidental. It demonstrates that ancient events, their outcomes, and even their political nuances were preserved across independent channels. For scholars, this is more than confirmation of details. It is confirmation of the reliability of the narrative's framework and its embedding in real history. After Lachish, the evidence extends into the daily life and administration of Judah. Small discoveries, bullae, seals, and inscriptions reveal officials, scribes, and the mechanisms of governance. These artifacts show that the kingdom was not only politically active, but also administratively sophisticated. The significance lies in the detail. It is one thing to confirm kings and battles. It is another to uncover the bureaucratic machinery of a state. These clay seals record contracts, correspondence, and authority. They are not literary symbols. they are tangible remnants of a functioning government embedded in the social and political fabric of the time. This administrative evidence complements the larger archaeological picture. It reinforces the reality of a structured society capable of implementing law, managing resources, and conducting complex affairs. Combined with earlier findings, kings, cities, sieges, the administrative data paints a vivid and multi-layered portrait of Judah as a living, functioning kingdom, rather than a loosely imagined setting for later narrative. Taken together, these discoveries show that the biblical world was materially grounded at multiple levels: political, military, urban, and bureaucratic. They reinforce the argument that Scripture preserves the memory of real institutions and the daily operations of a historical society, not just heroic legend. By the time we reach Qeiyafa, the pattern of historical confirmation becomes even more compelling. This fortified site provides evidence of a centralized, organized society in Judah during the early royal period. Its walls, gate structures, and urban layout indicate deliberate planning and social complexity, far beyond what skeptics once claimed. Qeiyafa challenges the argument that early Judah was too primitive to support the biblical narrative. The site shows a level of fortification, defense, and urban design consistent with a functioning kingdom. It is clear that Judah could maintain administrative control, organize military defenses, and sustain a structured community, as the biblical texts describe. The archaeological reality of Qeiyafa aligns with the textual record, demonstrating that early Judah was neither rudimentary nor entirely legendary. Instead, it was capable of producing a stable political and social system, a system that underpinned the events recorded in Scripture. This site, therefore, closes a crucial gap in the cumulative evidence. It confirms that the world described in the early books of the Bible corresponds to a historically verifiable kingdom. Through its material culture, fortifications, and urban planning, Qeiyafa affirms that the biblical account of early Judah is deeply rooted in historical reality. Up to this point, the discussion could be held in a relatively safe zone. Yes, it was controversial. Yes, it was unsettling. Yet it was still understandable. People are born, lineages are passed down, nations mix. Memory disperses across the world. It already sounds sensational, but it still fits within the logic of genealogy. However, now something entirely different begins. Blood on relics. Even those who had been listening calmly about priests, lost tribes, and Middle Eastern markers usually change expression at this point. Searching for traces of the past in living people is one thing. Accepting that the sacred relics, connected to the very heart of biblical and Christian history, might carry biological remnants of that world is quite another. Consider how this changes everything. If a relic is merely a symbol, a late object of veneration wrapped in legends and centuries of faith, then the debate concerns culture, tradition, and religious psychology. But if the relic truly contains blood, if any ancient biological material survives on it, albeit damaged, contaminated, or disputed, then the question can no longer be kept in the old frameworks. The relic stops being just an object of faith. It becomes a carrier of potential information. And information is already the territory of science, or at least a territory to which science approaches cautiously. This is why the topic of relics is so charged, because what is on the table is no longer simply ancient cloth or an old artifact. What is on the table is the possibility that the history of suffering, crucifixion, blood, and flesh is preserved not only as a theological account or ecclesiastical memory, but as a biological trace. And this creates an entirely different level of tension for everyone. For believers, because scientific intervention into the sacred always feels intrusive. For skeptics, because even the possibility of such analysis is unsettling. If a relic turns out not to be empty, but to hold traces consistent with the ancient Near Eastern context, with trauma, with blood, with real human flesh, the old certainties begin to unravel again. This is why the subject is always treated with such care. Too much caution. Too many discussions about contamination, methodological limits, and uncertainty. And yes, much of this caution is legitimate. But it is precisely this caution that generates the tension. Not because science cannot, but because it constantly approaches a door behind which there might be too much, and each time it stops at the threshold. At this point, the video reaches a major turning point, because now we move beyond ancestors, communities, and dispersal. We move to the objects that have lain at the center of Christian imagination for centuries, to the relics around which prayers, pilgrimages, debates, accusations, and reverence were built. And if even part of the blood on these relics is authentic, if even part of the trace belongs to a real ancient person, then we are no longer dealing with secondary echoes of the Bible. We are facing the direct, physical remnants of its most harrowing history. This is why the next stop is inevitable: the Shroud of Turin. A cloth that for decades has unsettled believers, scientists, and all who assumed a clear boundary between faith and empirical investigation had been drawn. Because perhaps, on that boundary, blood has been present all along. The Shroud of Turin is one of those relics before which both science and faith begin to behave strangely. No one passes by it calmly. For some, it is the greatest relic in the Christian world. For others, it is an elaborate forgery wrapped in centuries of mysticism. The problem is that the shroud refuses to fit neatly into either version. It does not disappear under criticism, and it never becomes an easy victory for belief. It remains like a piece of cloth that time has failed either to expose completely or to neutralize. That is exactly why it is so unsettling. People see on it a body, marks of torture, wounds consistent with crucifixion, traces of blood, not random stains, not accidental smears, but a pattern of suffering that has for decades drawn forensic experts, chemists, physicians, historians, and theologians into argument. The image alone is already explosive. But for us, the most important thing is not only the image, it is the blood. Because the moment blood appears on a relic, everything changes. We are no longer dealing merely with a symbol of suffering. We are dealing with biological residue, a trace of a body. Material that, at least in theory, may contain information. And this is where the most uncomfortable part begins for everyone involved. If the blood on the shroud is genuine, then the cloth may preserve something far more dangerous than a visual imprint. It may preserve biological memory. Damaged, ancient, contested, contaminated, but memory all the same. That is why there is so much tension around the shroud. Not because science is powerless, but because every serious step towards studying it runs into a wall of consequences. The moment one allows that the blood traces may contain ancient biomaterial, the question becomes almost explosive. At that point, the shroud can no longer be discussed merely as an object of devotion or a medieval work of art. It may instead be a relic, preserving the residue of a real human being, a person bound to one of the most terrifying stories in human civilization. And this is where the topic becomes irresistible. Not because it gives an answer, but because it seems to hover dangerously close to one. The shroud has always balanced on that edge. There are too many traces to discard it easily, too many disputed details to close the question once and for all, too much physical concreteness, blood, trauma, cloth, signs of contact with a body, for it to remain safely inside the realm of legend. And too many consequences if one were to admit that all of this may truly point to an ancient Near Eastern man who passed through execution. That is why the shroud has never stopped haunting the modern imagination. It lies before civilization like a challenge. As long as the debate concerned manuscripts and archaeology, distance was still possible. But blood on cloth is something else entirely. It feels like the past forcing its way physically into the present. It suggests that sacred history may have left behind not only an account, not only an image, but biological residue that remains dangerous even after centuries. And perhaps the most frightening thing is not what might be found. It is how close the world may already have come to finding it. Because every new cycle of discussion about the shroud returns to the same question. If this is real blood, why does no one ever go all the way? Why do the same phrases always return? Complicated, insufficient, contamination, no definitive conclusion possible. Of course, each of these can be explained scientifically, but their repetition creates a strange atmosphere. The atmosphere of a door approached again and again, but never opened fully. That is the real terror of the Shroud. Not only what may be depicted on it, but the possibility that inside the traces on this cloth lies information capable of moving the debate over faith into an entirely different dimension. Because then the question would no longer be, is the relic authentic? It would become something far more dangerous. Whose blood is this? And what else might it still be able to reveal? And once the viewer reaches that thought, the next step becomes inevitable. The Shroud is not the only cloth associated with this story. There is another relic, another trace, another layer of converging signs that makes everything even less comfortable. The Sudarium of Oviedo. And if one cloth can be treated as an argument, two cloths pointing in the same direction begin to sound very different indeed. If the Shroud of Turin already makes science and faith visibly uneasy, the Sudarium of Oviedo makes that unease almost physical. Because now we are no longer dealing with a single cloth around which one can build an entire world of suspicion, coincidence, late legend, and disputed interpretation. Now there is a second object, a second relic, a second trace. And the most unsettling part is that it does not contradict the first story. It seems to echo it. That is why the Sudarium matters so much here. In dry summary, it may sound modest enough. A cloth, traces of blood, an ancient tradition, studies of possible correspondences. But what truly grips the viewer is something else entirely, the principle itself. If there are two different relics, with different histories of preservation, different paths through the centuries, different destinies, and yet they still begin pointing toward the same pattern of suffering, the same type of injury, the same bodily drama, then it becomes far harder to dismiss everything as one beautiful mistake. This is where the subject turns almost hypnotic. One relic can still be treated as an anomaly, an exception, an object of cultivated mystique. But two lines converging unexpectedly are no longer just relics. They begin to look like a system of coincidences. And systems of coincidence are always more disturbing than isolated wonders. A miracle can be rejected, a coincidence can be explained away. But once coincidences begin repeating and forming a pattern, the mind is seized by a far more troubling impression. Perhaps what it is seeing is not chaos at all, but the trace of something real. That is exactly how the Sudarium works. It does not shout louder than the Shroud. It does not create the same overwhelming visual effect. But it does something that may be even more important. It places a second support beneath the same story. And in doing so, it raises the stakes. Because now we are no longer speaking only about one strange cloth with a troubling image. We are speaking about two relics, between which connections have been sought, two traces of blood, two fragments of what may be the same bodily reality. And that changes the atmosphere of the entire investigation. Because up to this point, the viewer can still hold on to the comforting idea that we are dealing with one isolated mystery. But the Sudarium breaks that defense. It says, in effect, no, this is not one strange object. It is a chain. And a chain is always worse for the skeptic. One anomaly may be chance. Two already demand explanation. Three begin to form a system. And the moment relics begin reinforcing one another, the debate shifts from a question of faith to a question of probability. And here, once again, blood returns to the center. And with it, that same forbidden tension. If the traces on these cloths really do belong to the same suffering body, if they preserve not only a visual echo, but a biological one, then we are no longer standing before a dispute over church tradition. We are standing before the possibility that the physical history of the Passion has survived much closer to us than anyone is comfortable admitting. This is where the viewer must not be given an easy escape. Not everything is proven, but rather, too much refuses to disappear. That is what makes it frightening. The traces do not go away. The convergences do not fade. These relics cannot be buried once and for all inside the archive of medieval fabrications. Every new round of discussion returns us to the same point. If there is nothing real behind these cloths, why do they keep behaving as though reality is still there? That is why the Sudarium of Oviedo is so important to the structure of the story. It does not merely supplement the shroud, it makes the shroud more dangerous. It turns a solitary enigma into a double one. And a double enigma always weighs more heavily, especially when both converge in the same zone. Blood, suffering, an ancient Near Eastern context, a bodily memory that time somehow failed to erase completely. And after that, the next question becomes almost unavoidable. If blood on relics truly preserves any information at all, then what, exactly, have researchers already managed to glimpse? Why do discussions keep circling back to blood type, to Near Eastern origin, to biological traces that seem to hint at something too serious to state outright, and yet are never carried all the way to a final conclusion? Because perhaps the most terrifying part of this entire story is not the absence of an answer. It is the possibility that the answer is already far too close. This is where the whole story becomes especially dense. Up to now, we could still speak about lineages, markers, dispersal, communities, and relics as a collection of strange and unsettling convergences. But at some point, the discussion inevitably reaches the thing that affects viewers more than anything else: blood. Not as symbol, not as church imagery, but as biological material that, even in fragmentary and disputed form, may still carry information. And this is exactly where the topic appears that always forces people to speak with unusual caution. Blood type, origin, Near Eastern context, the possibility of extracting from an ancient trace at least some clue about the person who left it behind. From the standpoint of strict science, this field is covered in warnings: contamination, age of the material, damage to samples, limits of interpretation. And all of that is true. But it is precisely this caution that gives the subject its force. The more caveats one hears, the clearer it becomes that we are no longer dealing with an empty legend. When an object is truly insignificant, no one builds such a wall of methodological fear around it. Those walls appear when the mistake would be too dangerous and the conclusion too heavy. And that is where a simple thought begins to take hold. If there really is blood on these relics, if some biological residue has survived, even in part, then the question can no longer be kept at a safe distance. The next level becomes unavoidable. What exactly can be said about it? Where did this person come from? Does the biological profile align with an ancient Near Eastern context? And if even part of the answer points in that direction, then the entire debate becomes far more frightening. Because at that point, we are no longer talking about a beautiful cloth or religious imagination. We are almost touching a body. That is what makes the subject of blood type and origin so charged. People hear the same combination of words: ancient relic, blood, possible Near Eastern link, and one nearly forbidden question immediately forms in the mind. Have we come too close to a real human being standing at the center of sacred history? And the closer that question sounds, the more nervous the entire conversation becomes. This is why the strongest approach here is not to say that everything has been proven, but something more disturbing. Too many signs keep pointing in the same direction. That lands harder. Because the viewer does not feel cheap sensation. The viewer feels pressure. Pressure from convergences. Pressure from limitations. Pressure from a subject that seems to bring science to the very edge of a final step it never quite takes. On one side, there is biological material. On the other, there is no definitive conclusion acceptable to everyone. And that incompleteness becomes almost hypnotic. It makes people feel not that there is nothing there, but that the full truth is never spoken aloud. That is where the central tension of this part of the story comes into focus. What is frightening is not that science has no answer. What is frightening is that it may already have come too close to one. Because if ancient blood can really tell us something about origin, biological context, and regional connection, then relics cease to be objects of devotion alone. They become something like sealed messages from the past, messages that lay for centuries at the center of faith and may now be read in an entirely different way. Through the molecule, through the fabric, through the residue of a body. And that is where the almost unthinkable question begins to emerge. If science can search for Aaron's trace through the paternal line, if it can detect the marks of dispersal across entire peoples, if it can move toward blood on relics, then where is the limit? Could it one day come closer still? So close that the discussion would no longer concern a people, a priesthood, or a cloth, but the biological profile of a person standing at the source of a sacred line, or a sacred event. That is where the most dangerous part of the investigation begins, because the next question sounds almost like blasphemy. Could the DNA of an ancient prophet ever be reconstructed? Could the DNA of an ancient prophet ever be reconstructed? Not long ago, that question would have sounded absurd. A mix of cheap science fiction, religious sacrilege, and laboratory madness. But the problem is that science often advances in exactly that way. What yesterday looked impossible becomes, today, a field of research. There was a time when reading ancient migrations from bone fragments seemed unimaginable. There was a time when tracing the origins of entire peoples from microscopic remnants sounded no less fantastical. Yet now, it is routine. And that is why a question that once invited laughter no longer sounds ridiculous. It sounds dangerous. Because if we are honest, we have already come disturbingly close to that boundary. We already know how to search for ancient continuity through the paternal line. We already know how to detect traces of dispersal across populations. We are already discussing blood on relics as a possible carrier of information. And at a certain point, all of this converges into one deeply unsettling thought. What if the biological trace of sacred history not only exists, but may one day become readable enough that we begin approaching specific figures from the ancient world? Of course, the moment this is said out loud, any careful scientist would immediately object. Where's the uncontaminated material? Where's the verified chain of custody? Where's the continuous line of samples? Where are the safeguards against false matches, corrupted data, contamination, and all the other factors capable of ruining a result? All of those objections are completely valid. But this part of the story works on a deeper level than technical procedure. It works as the feeling of approaching a forbidden threshold. Because the crucial point is not that someone is already sitting in a laboratory trying to assemble the genetic portrait of a prophet. The crucial point is something else entirely. Humanity has entered an age in which even asking such a question is no longer entirely impossible. And that changes everything. For centuries, sacred history was protected by time. It receded so far into the past that modern people could argue only with the text, with faith, or with archaeology. But now a new instrument exists. And that instrument works not with stone, not with papyrus, not with inscription, but with life itself. That is where the real chill should set in. Because if one day it became possible to approach the biological profile of a figure standing at the source of a sacred line, that would no longer be just a scientific discovery. It would be an intrusion into the most dangerous region of human memory. It is one thing to learn what an ancient city looked like. It is something entirely different to move toward the bodily reality of those whom the world has known for millennia as prophets, patriarchs, priests, and bearers of the covenant. At that point, the old distance between history and holiness begins to collapse. And perhaps that is why this subject produces such deep unease. Not because the answer has already been found, but because the question itself can no longer be dismissed as impossible. This is a decisive turning point for the whole narrative. Up to now, we have been dealing with the possibility that the Bible left biological traces in peoples, in dispersal, in relics. But now, the stakes rise even higher. Now the almost forbidden thought begins to take shape. If sacred history truly left a code behind, then sooner or later, someone will try to read it all the way through. And if that happens, the argument about faith changes forever. Because humanity will no longer be facing an abstract idea, but something much more unsettling, a nearly physical proximity to those it has long treated as belonging to the unreachable, sacred past. And that leads directly to another question. If this boundary is so dangerous, if even approaching it makes science speak in a language of caution, hesitation, and endless qualifications, then why does official science almost never say any of this plainly? Why is it that every time the conversation approaches the biological core of biblical history, the tone shifts from confidence to something closer to anxious restraint? Because perhaps the problem is not only the lack of data. Perhaps some doors are feared for another reason. Because once opened too quickly, they may never close again. This is where the story becomes strangest of all. Because if you look at it coldly, without emotion, something unusual begins to stand out. Whenever science deals with ancient bones, migrations, royal burials, vanished populations, or even highly disputed reconstructions, it can speak with a certain boldness. It proposes theories, it argues, it makes mistakes, it revises its conclusions, but it keeps moving forward. And yet the moment the discussion approaches the biological core of biblical history, priestly lineage, the lost tribes, blood on relics, the possibility of reading something uncomfortably close to the world of Scripture, the tone changes immediately. It becomes cautious to the point of pain. Suddenly the disclaimers multiply. Suddenly the language of maximum distance takes over. Nothing can be asserted with certainty. There is not enough data. The results require careful interpretation. Any conclusions would be premature. Formally, all of that is entirely correct. Serious science should speak that way. But the problem is that, in this subject, the caution does not feel like ordinary methodological discipline. It feels like fear of getting too close. And the viewer feels that instinctively. Because when the subject is an ancient sword, a shard of pottery, or even a disputed tomb, the world does not freeze. But the moment the conversation turns to the possibility that biblical history left behind a biological trace, everything changes. At that point, the stakes are no longer confined to a single scientific dispute. What is at stake is the boundary humanity has grown used to maintaining. The boundary between what belongs to faith and what might suddenly become readable as physical reality. And that is far more dangerous. Because if that possibility were acknowledged too directly, it would set off a chain reaction. It would mean admitting that ancient religious tradition may have preserved not only symbolic meaning, but real continuity. That dispersal may have been not only a textual narrative, but a biological event. That relics may be not only objects of veneration, but carriers of information. And then the old, comfortable wall between faith and science would begin collapsing not in philosophy, but in the material of the body itself. That is why official science almost never speaks about this in a way that allows the wider public to feel the full scale of what is happening. It breaks the subject into fragments. It separates population genetics from religious tradition, relic studies from cultural memory, lineage from theology. And in that fragmented form, everything appears manageable, safe. But the moment you assemble the pieces into a single chain, it becomes obvious why that synthesis is so unwelcome. Because together, they no longer sound like a series of careful studies. They sound like one large and deeply troubling idea. That the biblical world may have survived not only in a book, but in humanity itself. And perhaps that is what no one wants to say too plainly. Not because science is hiding some secret conspiracy. The truth is subtler and more unsettling. Modern systems of knowledge are simply not built to handle things that break their old boundaries. They prefer endless qualification, caution, fragmentation of meaning, because a direct admission would not change one conclusion. It would change the entire structure of the conversation. And here, the price of that conversation is too high. Because if the biological trace of the Bible is real, even in part, even in fragments, then it strikes both sides at once. It becomes harder for skeptics to treat Scripture as a beautiful late legend. And it becomes harder for believers to keep the sacred past entirely beyond the reach of science. That is why a strange silence always forms around this topic. Not emptiness, not absence of evidence. Silence. The kind of silence that appears when everyone senses the same thing. The next step may go too far. Because it is one thing to study history. It is another thing entirely to realize that history may have been living inside people all along. Inside lineages, inside blood, inside things long treated as sacred objects and nothing more. And that is why we have reached the true climax of this investigation. Because now, everything has to be brought together. The priestly line, the lost tribes, the limba, the scattered lines across the world, blood on relics, the shroud, the Sudarium, the fear of the final step. And all of it has to be seen not as a collection of strange subjects, but as one and the same story trying to return, this time not through stone, but through code. And now we arrive at the final and most dangerous turn in this entire story. Because once all these lines, relics, convergences, and forbidden questions are laid side by side, one central truth begins to emerge. Each topic can still be simplified when taken alone. One can say that the priestly line is merely a genetic curiosity, that the lemba are simply a striking ethnic legend, that the lost tribes are an eternal myth people project onto any mysterious population, that the shroud is only a disputed relic, that the Sudarium is just another religious enigma wrapped in too much emotion and too few definitive answers, and that any talk of recovering the DNA of prophets belongs to fantasy. Taken one by one, perhaps. But the problem was never any single topic. The problem is the chain. Too many things pull in the same direction. Too many things force the same question. Too many things behave as though the Bible left behind not only text, not only archaeology, not only religious memory, but a biological trace. Look at what actually begins to take shape. There is an ancient tradition about the line of Aaron, and there is a genetic phenomenon that makes that tradition disturbingly concrete. There is a history of dispersal, and there are people scattered across the world whose traces fit far too poorly with the easy explanation of just a beautiful legend. There are the lemba, distant communities, unusual paternal lines leading where official history does not like to look for too long. There are relics on which blood may have been preserved. There is the shroud, refusing to leave the conversation decade after decade. There is the Sudarium, making the unease worse not by offering an answer, but by repeating the convergence. And over all of it hovers the growing sense that science has come to the threshold of something far more serious than ancient history alone, a biological memory of the sacred world. And at a certain point, it becomes impossible to pretend these are just disconnected curiosities. Because when the same pattern returns again and again, the mind no longer resists the facts themselves. It resists their cumulative force. What is truly frightening is not the individual coincidence. It is their density. Frightening is the possibility that a priestly line might be not only a religious image, but a surviving paternal continuity. Frightening is the thought that the lost tribes may not have vanished at all, but dispersed and dissolved into humanity. Frightening is the idea that a relic might cease to be only an icon of memory and become an object still carrying traces of a real human body. And this is where the whole debate turns inside out. For too long, the question was framed like this: can science prove the Bible? But perhaps that was the wrong question from the very beginning. Perhaps the issue was never about proving faith in some crude laboratory sense. Perhaps the issue is that science, step by step, has been approaching traces of the very reality Scripture has always described. Not miracle as such, not God as a formula, but the world of people, blood, lineages, exile, priesthood, and bodily memory that survived across millennia. And that is what makes all of this so profoundly uncomfortable. Because then the old dividing line begins to fail. The comforting boundary where faith lives on one side and science on the other, where the Bible may be respected as symbol, but not taken seriously as a trace of real history still living inside human beings. If that boundary is really beginning to blur, then something far more serious has to be admitted. Sacred history may never have been entirely past. It may have survived. In the paternal line, in scattered peoples, in hidden continuity, in blood on cloth, in a code humanity is only beginning to learn how to read. And that is why the whole subject sounds so troubling. Not because there is already a final answer, but because we have come far too close to a question that, not long ago, was considered impossible. Too close to the thought that the biblical world did not vanish without remainder, that it did not dissolve completely into legend, that it did not remain only in liturgy and text. It may have endured as biological memory, dispersed through humanity, and hidden in objects long treated as nothing more than sacred relics. And if that is true, then the real final question no longer sounds the way it did at the beginning. Not, can science prove miracle? Not, was the Bible literally right about everything? But something else entirely. What if the Bible has been leaving behind not only a spiritual message, but the physical code of its own world? And only now are we beginning to understand where that code was hidden. In blood, in the body, in the line from father to son, in the dispersal of peoples, in relics humanity feared for centuries to approach too closely. And then what stands before us is no longer a scientific question on one side and a theological question on the other. What stands before us is a single question from which there is no easy retreat. If one day we truly read that code to the end, will it make faith stronger? Or will the world discover that it was never prepared for the possibility that sacred history had been living inside us all along? And this is where everything finally comes together. After all the bloodlines, relics, convergences, and forbidden questions, one thing becomes impossible to ignore. Taken separately, each subject can still be minimized. The priestly line can be dismissed as an unusual genetic pattern. The lemba can be reduced to a remarkable ethnic tradition. The lost tribes can be treated as a myth humanity keeps projecting onto distant peoples. The shroud can be called a disputed relic. The Sudarium can be pushed aside as yet another religious mystery surrounded by emotion and uncertainty. And any discussion of recovering the DNA of prophets can still be mocked as fantasy. Individually, perhaps, but the problem was never any single subject. The problem is the chain. Too much points in the same direction. Too many lines lead back to the same question. Too many things behave as though the Bible left behind not only text, not only archaeology, not only memory, but biological residue. Look at what emerges when everything is placed side by side. There is an ancient tradition about the line of Aaron, and there is a genetic pattern that makes that tradition feel unsettlingly concrete. There is the story of dispersal, and there are peoples scattered across the world whose traces fit far too poorly with the easy explanation of just a legend. There are distant communities, unusual paternal lines, and fragments of memory leading where official history does not like to look too long. There are relics that may preserve blood. There is the shroud, refusing to leave the conversation. There is the Sudarium, intensifying the tension, not by solving the mystery, but by repeating the pattern. And over all of it hangs the growing impression that science has approached not merely ancient history, but the biological memory of a sacred world. And at some point, it becomes impossible to keep pretending that all of this is just a collection of unrelated curiosities. Because what is frightening is not one coincidence. It is their density. It is the repeated return of the same pattern. Frightening is the possibility that a priestly line may be not only a religious idea, but a surviving paternal continuity. Frightening is the thought that the lost tribes may not have vanished at all, but dissolved into humanity. Frightening is the possibility that a relic may stop being only an icon of memory and begin to look like an object still carrying the residue of a real body. This is the point where the entire argument turns inside out. For too long, the question was framed like this: can science prove the Bible? But perhaps that was always the wrong question. Perhaps the issue was never about proving faith in some crude laboratory sense. Perhaps the issue is that science, step by step, keeps approaching traces of the reality Scripture has always described. Not miracle as formula, not God as data, but the world of people, blood, lineage, exile, priesthood, and bodily memory that may have survived across millennia. And that is what makes the subject so deeply uncomfortable. Because then the old dividing line begins to collapse. The comforting line where faith belongs on one side and science on the other, where the Bible may be respected as symbol, but never treated as a trace of real history still living inside human beings. If that line is beginning to blur, then something far more serious has to be admitted. Sacred history may never have been entirely past. It may have survived. In the paternal line, in scattered peoples, in hidden continuity, in blood on cloth, in a code humanity is only just beginning to learn how to read. And that is why the whole story sounds so unsettling. Not because we already have a final answer, but because we have come too close to a question that would once have sounded impossible. Too close to the thought that the biblical world did not vanish without remainder, that it did not dissolve completely into legend, that it did not remain only in liturgy and text. It may have endured as biological memory, dispersed through humanity, and concealed in objects long treated as sacred relics and nothing more. And if that is true, then the final question no longer sounds the way it did at the beginning. Not, can science prove miracle? Not, was the Bible literally right about everything? But something far more dangerous. What if the Bible has been leaving behind not only a spiritual message, but the physical code of its world? And only now are we beginning to understand where that code was hidden. In blood, in the body, in the line from father to son, in the dispersal of peoples, in relics humanity feared for centuries to approach too closely. And then what stands before us is no longer a scientific question on one side and a theological question on the other. What stands before us is a single question from which there is no easy retreat. If one day we truly read that code to the end, will it make faith stronger? Or will the world discover that it was never prepared for the possibility that sacred history had been living inside us all along?